I was with Max in Caracas for 3 weeks. We were in Venezuela. And I recently had the opportunity to address a crowd of just over 1,000 U.S. citizens gathered outside of the White House in Washington, D.C., who had come to the nation's capital from all over the country in order to voice their opposition to a U.S.-led military war on Venezuela. My message was this: it's imperative that the U.S. public and the world resist any attempt to further militarize the crisis in Venezuela. However, we must understand the war against the country has already begun. Washington could not defeat Hugo Chavez, although it tried. So shortly after his death in 2013, the U.S. escalated its attempts to overthrow the Bolivarian government. Most significantly, on March 9, 2015, President Barack Obama declared Venezuela to be a national security threat to the United States. Venezuela, a nation which provides, as just one example, heating oil for thousands of impoverished New York citizens, was somehow characterized as a threat. In my view, this action by the Obama administration served as the opening shot in a new phase in the war against Venezuela, an economic war with the intended goal of overthrowing the Bolivarian government and replacing it with a regime which will better suit the interests of international industry and capital, therefore, of course, Washington as well. When Ricardo Hausmann, an advisor to opposition leader Juan Guaido, recently told Reuters their group plans to open the nation's oil reserves up to private investment, this agenda became more clear. In an interview with CBS News, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo recently declared U.S. sanctions will, quote, overthrow the regime in Iran. He boldly stated, quote, we're convinced we will lead the Iranian people to rise up. There you have a top U.S. official admitting the goal of sanctions is to pressure the Iranian public to overthrow their government by strangling its economy. This is financial terrorism. In Venezuela, I met victims of this same financial terrorism, and you'll hear from them in a moment. The U.S. policy of coercive unilateral sanctions should be seen for what it is, collective punishment, which according to Article 33 of the Geneva Convention is a war crime. The U.S.-led war on Venezuela has already begun. The U.S. tells us in Europe and the States that this policy is justified because it must restore democracy in Venezuela. Yet in Venezuela, I witnessed a system that is in many ways more democratic than the one I'm subject to in the United States, where my fellow citizens do not have public health care, are deprived of economic security, and are subjected to one of the most sophisticated and aggressive government surveillance apparatuses in the world. But these are subjects for another time. Having been in Venezuela recently, I know the U.S. goal is not to restore democracy. How do I know that? Because I've learned the Venezuelan opposition is anti-democratic. In fact, it is violent and oppressive in its nature. During what Western media describes as protests in Venezuela in 2017, the opposition set up roadblocks in order to cut off parts of the country from the rest and hurt the economy. I actually spoke with one journalist, Victor Hugo Manajo, who told me residents living in his Caracas suburb were unable to leave, trapped under siege after opposition militants shut down the main bridge which leads in and out of the town for at least 2 weeks. As a journalist who witnessed Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter protests for years in the States, I saw the harsh police response and shuddered to think what would happen if U.S. citizens attempted such violent actions. Opposition militants have also assassinated government supporters, including 21-year-old Orlando Figueroa, a black Chavista who was beaten, stabbed, doused in gasoline, and burned alive by the so-called activists of the opposition. Just last week, his mother told UN investigators in Caracas that the opposition are not, quote, peaceful demonstrators. They are bloodthirsty. And I can second her statement. Through my own experience with opposition supporters, which is obviously less extreme than her son's, but still notable. When I recently tweeted out a video in support of the U.S. march in Washington to resist a war on Venezuela, I was flooded with thousands, and you can see them online, thousands, 5,000, messages from the opposition wishing death on me and my non-existent children, calling my mother a dog. These are the people my government would like to have restore democracy in Venezuela. On February 23rd, when the U.S. orchestrated a media circus on the border with Colombia in order to justify further intervention, and failed, by the way, only because the Venezuelan public and military were prepared to fight back, I attended an opposition rally in Caracas. I want you to watch the way these people treated a Spanish journalist who attempted to report from the scene, explaining that the opposition didn't necessarily represent the majority in Venezuela and that a pro-government rally was also taking place that day. Yeah. You can hear them, they're yelling mentirosa, mentirosa, they're calling her a liar. I think you get the idea. She was unable to finish her report because a mob surrounded her and prevented her from telling a simple truth. Simply, all she wanted to say was that these people weren't necessarily the majority in the country. Just as they mobbed me online in an attempt to bully me for organizing a protest to resist U.S. military intervention in their country. And I don't doubt for a moment they targeted me because I'm a young woman they believe they can easily silence. I'm a little less intimidating than Max, if you don't know me. This is the heart and soul of the Venezuelan opposition. These are the supposed Democrats. Members of the Venezuelan opposition insisted to me that President Maduro bribes his people to vote for him by giving them food and other social programs. I thought, wow, considering 41 million people in my country live in poverty and 13 million children go hungry every day, I wish we had a government which cared enough to bribe us with the things we actually need. But we don't ever hear President Trump or Secretary Pompeo or Senator Rubio talk about the crisis at home or promise struggling U.S. citizens humanitarian aid. In fact, they've drastically reduced social spending on our already decimated welfare state in order to pass tax cuts for the wealthy and a record $717 billion military spending package. They want that money to wage war against any nation which defies their agenda, not just Venezuela. Which is why this current moment is not simply about defending Venezuela, it's about defending the basic principles outlined in the UN's Charter: territorial integrity, self-determination, and sovereignty. Since the end of World War II, the United States has carried out regime change operations in 67 countries. I'm sorry to say, but this means the UN has failed in its mission on 67 separate occasions. You now have the opportunity to prevent Venezuela from becoming the 68th failure. The current U.S. government has made your job much easier. Look at how they behave, walking out whenever the internationally recognized Venezuelan government takes the floor, bullying allies into supporting their aggressions, withdrawing from and insulting this very commission dedicated to preserving human rights. As a U.S. citizen, I'm embarrassed by their conduct. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo admits sanctions are designed to encourage regime change. White House National Security Advisor John Bolton concedes the U.S. would like to have its hands in Venezuela's oil. Senator Marco Rubio, from the border of Colombia and Venezuela on February 24th, actually tweeted out a photograph of late Libyan revolutionary leader Muammar Gaddafi after he'd been sodomized by U.S.-backed jihadists in his hometown of Sirte, following the U.S. war to wage regime change in Libya. This was an outrageous threat directed against Venezuela's democratically elected president, Nicolas Maduro. U.S. objectives to undermine and overthrow the founding principles of the United Nations have never been more clear. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. It's time for the UN to recognize U.S. sanctions against all nations as an illegal act of war. The UN must condemn the U.S. for its constant threats of force against Venezuela and promote dialogue as the solution to this current impasse, starting with the Montevideo mechanism established in February. The mask of the U.S. is off, exposing a country dedicated to subverting independent states which challenge its objectives driven by international capital. The question now becomes, how will the rest of the world, united, stand up to these aggressions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anya, and we assure you that we are doing our best to denounce the U.S.
Yes, I don't mean to say that the UN is not a wonderful organization.
No, we are trying very
It's just
hard
time to achieve your full potential.
Yeah. And thank you very much also for recalling the true nature of the supposed democrats that your government want to see governing Venezuela, and you have all our solidarity for the personal attack you received. And also thank you for recalling the issue of the financial terrorism, what you mentioned before. As the Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measure, Idris Jazairi, recently in a press statement, states sanction which can, I'm quoting, sanction which can lead to starvation and medical shortage are not the answer to the crisis in Venezuela.